To support the creation of these original Sherlock Holmes stories, please consider joining our Patreon. Membership grants you early access to our content prior to its YouTube publication. We rely on monetary support from viewers like you to maintain the channel. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. It was a stifling, oppressive afternoon in late July, the sort that seemed to bake the very bricks of Baker Street and suspend the city's usual veil of soot in a stagnant, suffocating haze. The air in our first-floor sitting room was entirely bereft of motion, heavy with the trapped heat of the day. Even the bluebottles that typically tormented us in the summer months seemed to have surrendered to the lethargy, clinging lazily to the window panes. I found myself slouched in my armchair, my collar unbuttoned and my waistcoat discarded, attempting to find some illusion of a breeze by rhythmically fanning myself with the latest edition of The Strand. My companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was immersed in one of his periods of profound summer indolence, a state of absolute physical inertia that often served as the chrysalis for his most brilliant mental awakenings. He lay stretched upon the sofa, an unopened newspaper upon his chest, and a heavy, leather-bound volume of medieval charters balanced precariously on his nose, effectively shielding his eyes from the glare. The air hung heavy with the acrid scent of his shag tobacco, a fragrance which, on this particular afternoon, only added to the suffocating atmosphere of our quarters. To the casual observer he might have appeared asleep, but I knew from the occasional twitch of his long, nervous fingers that his mind was churning with restless energy, desperate for a puzzle to chew upon. "Another case for the official mind to bungle, I perceive, Watson," Holmes murmured suddenly, without opening his eyes, as if privy to the very thoughts stirring within my own skull. "Indeed, Holmes," I replied, wiping my brow with a sodden handkerchief. "Though I confess I was merely contemplating the egregious cost of block ice, now that this heat-wave is truly upon us. The prices have nearly doubled since Tuesday." Holmes chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves rustling across a pavement. With a swift movement he plucked the heavy tome from his face and tossed it onto a nearby chair, sitting up with a sudden fluid grace. "Your thoughts, my dear fellow, remain an open book to me, written in the most legible of fonts. The paragraph you were perusing, a rather sensational half-column account of a gentleman found wandering in the city, quite lost to himself, was accompanied by a marginal note concerning the recent increase in the ice merchants' rates. You tapped your pen against the paper in a rhythm of distinct annoyance immediately after reading the headline. A simple deduction, if one trains the faculties to observe the minutiae of human frustration." I laid down the paper with a sigh, my perennial astonishment at his powers in no way diminished by our long acquaintance. "You refer, then, to the unfortunate soul discovered by a constable near Cheapside, the one with no memory, carrying a veritable treasure trove of ancient Greek coins in his pocket?" "Precisely," Holmes said, at last stirring fully. His lean form uncoiled from the sofa, and he advanced to the open window, gazing out at the glaring, sun-baked street below, where the occasional hansom cab clattered past in a cloud of dry dust. "A curious affair, Watson, and a welcome respite from the dreary monotony of this heat. The police, no doubt, are entirely bewildered. The coins alone suggest a man of distinguished station, perhaps a collector or a museum curator. Yet his present state indicates an almost deliberate erasure of identity. Men of wealth do not simply forget who they are while wandering the financial district. Such a paradox invites investigation. The words were barely out of his mouth when a hesitant shuffling knock sounded at our door. Mrs. Hudson, looking entirely wilted by the heat, her face flushed and her apron somewhat askew, ushered in a figure who seemed entirely incongruous with the blazing summer day. He was a man of advanced years, perhaps 70, with a shock of pure white hair that stood out in wild disarray against a face etched with lines of profound confusion and deep-seated terror. Despite the sweltering temperature, which must have been near 90 degrees, he was clad in a heavy tweed suit and a thick woolen overcoat buttoned securely to the chin. He was perspiring profusely, beads of sweat rolling down his pallid cheeks, but he shivered continuously. His pale, watery eyes held a vacant, searching expression, the look of a trapped animal that plucked immediately at the heartstrings. "This is Mr. John Doe, gentlemen," Mrs. Hudson announced, offering a solicitous maternal glance at the newcomer. "The constable on duty at Bow Street sent him along. They remembered how you helped with that amnesiac sailor last winter, Mr. Holmes, and thought you might have some insight into this poor soul's predicament." Holmes immediately stepped forward, his lethargy vanishing like smoke in a gale. With surprising gentleness, he assisted the man out of his suffocating overcoat, tossing it onto the sofa. "Do sit down, Mr. Doe. Mrs. Hudson, a pitcher of iced lemon water, if you please, and perhaps a cool cloth for his forehead. We must lower our guest's temperature before he faints outright." The old man shuffled forward, his movements uncertain and uncoordinated, and collapsed into my vacated armchair. He clutched a small, dirt-stained canvas bag tightly in one trembling hand, his knuckles white with the strain of his grip. "Doe?" he murmured, his voice reedy, thin and raspy from dehydration. "Is that my name? They call me that, but it means nothing. I cannot remember." He looked from Holmes to me, his brow furrowed in desperate appeal, his hands fluttering helplessly. "Everything. My home, my family, the very face in the mirror. It's gone. It is a terrifying void. Only these remain." He opened the canvas bag, tipping a cascade of dull metallic discs onto the small side table beside him. They fell with a heavy musical clatter. Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes alight with an almost predatory interest. I, too, was drawn to the sight. They were indeed ancient Greek coins, some of bronze, some of heavily tarnished silver, their surfaces darkened by centuries of burial and handling. Yet their finely struck images remained beautifully discernible. The proud profile of Athena in her crested helmet, a stylized owl clutching an olive sprig, a leaping dolphin, the formidable godlike features of Alexander the Great wearing the horn of Ammon. Holmes pulled his magnifying glass from his pocket and picked up one of the heavier silver pieces, turning it over in his long, sensitive fingers. He weighed it momentarily, feeling the irregular edges. "A tetradrachm from Athens, 5th century B.C., he observed, murmuring almost to himself. "Note the archaic smile on Athena's lips, Watson, and the depth of the strike. And this, a rare stater from Lampsacus, a generation later. Exquisite! This smaller silver drachma bears a portrait of Antiochus Soter from the Seleucid Empire in Syria." Holmes looked up, his gaze piercing the old man. "A formidable collection, sir. Furthermore, I surmise it is a working assemblage. These are clearly intended for active study rather than mere exhibition." "How can you possibly know that, Holmes?" I asked, squinting at the worn metal. "Look closely at the patina, Watson. A gentleman collector who merely shows off his wealth keeps his coins in velvet trays, polishing them to an unnatural shine. These coins bear the specific oils of frequent bare-handed handling. They are grouped, even as they tumbled from the bag, by specific eras of Aegean trade routes. These are the tools of a scholar, a man who uses them to cross-reference historical texts." He looked keenly at the old man once more. "You are a scholar of numismatics, perhaps? An archaeologist?" The old man shook his head slowly, fresh tears welling in his vacant eyes. "I don't know. I feel a resonance when I touch them. I know what they are, yes. I know their names, their weights, their historical context. I could tell you the metallurgical composition of that tetradrachm. But how I know them, or why I possess them, the narrative of my own life, that is entirely lost." He passed a trembling hand over his face. "They found me wandering near St. Paul's. The noise, the carriages, the sheer volume of people, it was a nightmare. I had no idea where I was or where I was meant to be. The police were kind, although they could offer no answers." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, taking the iced water Mrs. Hudson had just brought and pressing a glass into the man's hands. He picked up several more coins, examining them under the glass. "No identification in your pockets, save these, you say? No wallet, no calling cards, no letters, no tailor's tags on your garments, no key ring to suggest a home to return to?" "Nothing, sir. Empty. My pockets were as empty as my mind." "And you recall absolutely nothing of your recent past? No flashes of memory regarding how you came to be in London? Where you were before you found yourself near Cheapside?" "Only a vague, impressionistic sense of greens, of ancient trees, perhaps oaks or yews, and a feeling of profound, bone-deep weariness, as if I have been travelling for weeks or perhaps working incessantly at some great physical or mental task." He shivered again, spilling a drop of his water, despite the oppressive heat of the room. "And sometimes, when the silence falls, a voice, low, rhythmic, and incredibly insistent. The tone is commanding, but the words themselves escape me, like smoke through a keyhole." Holmes rose and began to pace the room, hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. "A curious case, Watson, and a dark one. The man is clearly of education, refinement, and specialized intellect, yet utterly bereft of personal memory. The complete lack of any other identification suggests a deliberate, methodical act of stripping him of his persona. A common footpad would steal the coins and leave the wallet. Whoever did this left the priceless coins and stole the identity. The voice, that rhythmic, commanding tone, that is most intriguing of all." He turned to the old man, his voice softening. "Mr. Doe, would you be willing to allow me to take these coins for closer study? I assure you, upon my honour, they will be safe in my keeping." The old man nodded meekly, slumping back into the chair. "Take them. They mean nothing to me now, save a tormenting whisper of a life I have lost. I would give every piece of silver in that bag merely to know my own Christian name." "Excellent," Holmes said, scooping the coins back into the canvas bag with surprising reverence. Now, Watson, if you would be so good as to don your hat, I believe a visit to Bow Street is in order. We must review the exact circumstances of his discovery, and perhaps take a carriage down to Mercer's Hall. The geography of his abandonment may provide the first thread of this tangled skein. Our visit to Bow Street yielded little further concrete information, though Inspector Lestrade, sweating profusely in his heavy uniform, was entirely willing to share the sparse details. "A blank slate, Mr. Holmes. That's what he is," Lestrade complained, mopping his neck with a checkered cloth. "We've put out feelers across the city, inquiring about missing persons, telegraphing the asylums and the hospitals, all to no avail. No one is looking for an eccentric grandfather with a pocket full of Greek change." Holmes merely smiled enigmatically. "Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, Lestrade. Tell me exactly where was he found? The precise paving stone, if you please." "Near the old Mercer's Hall, sir, just off Cheapside. A constable saw him nearly walk blindly into a passing hansom cab. He seemed completely disoriented, terrified by the summer traffic, as if he hadn't seen a bustling city street in decades. We took a hansom down to the city, braving the suffocating heat and the crush of afternoon commerce. Holmes spent 20 minutes pacing the pavement near Mercer's Hall, examining the gutters, the alignment of the alleyways, and even the proximity of the nearest railway stations. The subsequent carriage ride back to Baker Street was a stifling affair, the heat radiating from the cobblestones and the leather seats alike. But Holmes remained steeped in silent, intense contemplation, his eyes half closed. Back at Baker Street, while our client rested in the spare bedroom, Holmes arrayed the Greek coins on his Persian rug, sorting them by provenance and period into neat chronological columns. He pulled several heavy, dust-covered volumes on numismatics and classical archaeology from his most obscure shelves, piling them around him on the floor. His concentration was absolute. For hours, the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the mantel clock, the occasional scratch of a match as he lit another pipe, and the rustle of dry pages turning. The afternoon stretched into evening, the oppressive heat slowly giving way to a balmy, breathless dusk that brought no real relief. "Watson," he said at length, breaking nearly 4 hours of silence, his voice cracking slightly from the smoke, "do you recall the scandalous disappearance of Professor Arthur Ainsworth some weeks past? The eminent Hellenic archaeologist, formerly of Oxford, known for his groundbreaking work on ancient trade routes and his almost obsessive pursuit of the so-called Kentish hoard." I frowned, racking my memory, trying to push through the lethargy of the heat. Ainsworth. Yes, the name certainly rings a bell. Didn't he vanish from his country estate down in Kent? Near Canterbury, if I recall. The papers made a brief fuss about it. No trace of him was found, his study was left in perfect order, and I believe foul play was widely suspected, though the local constabulary eventually wrote it off as an eccentric academic wandering off. "Indeed, they were fools to do so," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. Ainsworth's magnum opus, The Commerce of the Aeolian Coast, contains an entire chapter dedicated to the very issues of currency we have arrayed upon this rug. These coins possess both immense monetary value and the distinct markers of a working collection. They tell a story that only one man could read intimately. He held up a small, almost insignificant bronze coin, holding it carefully by the edges, then tapped a heavy open volume on his desk. This piece, a rather common provincial issue from the reign of Trajan, bears a faint, highly specific accidental scratch near the emperor's bust. I have just cross-referenced it with this photographic plate in Ainsworth's published catalogue, raisonné, of his private collection. The scratch is identical down to the micrometer. Our friend sleeping in the next room, Mr. Doe, is none other than Professor Arthur Ainsworth. My jaw dropped, and I sat forward, the heat momentarily forgotten. But Holmes, his memory. How could a man of such towering intellect be reduced to this pitiful state? He doesn't even know his own name. Holmes steepled his long fingers, his expression grave and shadowed. Amnesia of this profound and specific nature is rarely accidental, Watson. It is not the result of a blow to the head, which usually produces localized memory loss or physical symptoms. Coupled with his sudden disappearance, it suggests a most sinister, calculated explanation. Someone desired to extract highly specific information from Professor Ainsworth regarding the Kentish hoard. Information so valuable that they methodically obliterated his identity to achieve their ends and to ensure his subsequent silence. "You believe he was kidnapped and coerced?" I asked, horrified. "But how? Torture?" "No," Holmes said firmly. "Crude methods of physical torture might yield a name or a combination to a safe, but they simultaneously risk the destruction of the very knowledge sought. Fear muddles the mind. A refined, insidious approach would be required to extract complex spatial details, such as the location of a buried, unmapped archaeological hoard. The old man's vague recollection of a low, rhythmic, insistent voice points directly to the dark art of mesmerism or hypnosis. His physical weariness and the total fracturing of his conscious memory suggest the prolonged, systematic use of strong narcotics to break down his mental defences and facilitate this trance-like state. Holmes immediately pulled a telegraph blank toward him and drafted a rapid message to the Canterbury Constabulary, requesting specific details about the state of Ainsworth's home upon his disappearance. While awaiting a reply, he threw himself into his extensive self-compiled index of London's criminal underworld, cross-referencing illicit antiquities dealers, known smugglers, and individuals with a recorded interest in chemical subjugation and the occult. The following morning, as the sun began to bake the city once more, the reply from Canterbury arrived via messenger. Holmes ripped it open and read it aloud. Ainsworth's estate had shown no sign of forced entry. His housekeeper reported that only one item was missing from the entire house, a small, inconspicuous glass file usually kept in a locked desk drawer. Its contents were a powerful, highly concentrated liquid opiate, prescribed by a London specialist for the professor's severe chronic insomnia. Holmes gave a sharp exclamation, striking the table with his fist. "The pieces locked together with frightening precision, Watson. The kidnappers did not need to break down the door." They waited until the professor was settled, likely slipping a massive incapacitating dose of his own prescribed sedative into his evening tea or port. Once rendered entirely pliable and unconscious, he could be spirited away to a secluded location for weeks of uninterrupted drug-assisted hypnotic treatment. But who, Holmes? Who possesses the knowledge to care about Roman hordes, the criminality to orchestrate an abduction, and the sinister medical knowledge to wipe a man's mind? "A man named Silas Blackwood," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "An antiquities dealer with a purportedly respectable shop in Bloomsbury, and a thoroughly rotten soul. He moves in the highest circles of society, selling to dukes and earls, but my network informs me Blackwood was recently making highly specific, aggressive and well-funded inquiries at the British Museum regarding obscure Roman land deeds in Kent, the exact focus of Ainsworth's unpublished research. Furthermore, Blackwood owns a remote, walled property in Surrey, an ideal isolated location for holding a prisoner and conducting his psychological torment without interference." Holmes spent the next few hours coordinating with his Baker Street irregulars, dispatching his street urchins to the various railway stations and to keep watch on Blackwood's Bloomsbury shop. By late afternoon, a grubby but sharp-eyed boy arrived at our door, breathless, bearing news. Blackwood's Surrey property had been hastily evacuated the previous night under the cover of darkness. The boy had witnessed several heavy iron-banded crates being loaded onto a reinforced wagon heading southeast toward the Kentish coast. "He has the location!" Holmes declared, leaping to his feet and grabbing his revolver from the desk drawer. He has squeezed the professor's mind dry, dumped the empty husk in London as a distraction, and is moving to secure the hoard right now. There is no time to lose, Watson. Pack your own service revolver and a dark lantern. We are catching the next express train to Canterbury. It was a suffocating, starless night when we finally arrived in the rural outskirts of Barham, a small village nestled deep in the Kentish countryside. Holmes, myself, and Inspector Lestrade, whom we had collected via urgent telegram at Scotland Yard along the way, navigated the dry, rutted lanes in a hired trap. The July heat lingered stubbornly over the fields, the air thick with the smell of dry wheat and alive with the deafening rhythmic chirp of crickets. According to Holmes's rapid train-bound study of Ainsworth's stolen notes, which he had deduced the general shape of based on Blackwood's inquiries at the museum, the Kentish hoard lay not beneath the main foundations of the known Roman villa, as most treasure hunters assumed, but deeply buried beneath an older, pre-Roman Celtic tumulus a mile to the north. We approached a dilapidated farm property on foot, leaving the trap hidden behind a copse of yew trees. We were guided through the pitch-black fields by the faint, eerie glow of lanterns in the distance. Peeking over a rise of dry earth, we beheld the excavation pit. Two men toiled in the oppressive heat, their shirts soaked with sweat. One was a burly, scarred labourer wielding a heavy spade, throwing dirt over his shoulder in a steady rhythm. The other, slender, sharp-featured and impeccably dressed despite the dirt and the heat, was Silas Blackwood himself. He directed the dig with an air of cold, arrogant authority, consulting a hand-drawn map that I instantly recognised as having been penned by the trembling hand of Professor Ainsworth. Before them, half exposed from the dark earth, lay a massive brass-bound wooden chest. The wood was black with rot, but the metal held fast. Through a decayed gap in the lid, a magnificent gleam of ancient gold and verdigris. Stained bronze reflected in the flickering lantern light. "We have you surrounded, Blackwood." Lestrade's voice boomed across the humid night air, shattering the rural silence. At his signal, 4 sturdy constables stepped out from the tree line, their truncheons drawn. Blackwood froze, his calculating eyes darting toward the darkness, assessing the trap. Recognizing Holmes standing tall on the ridge, a sneer of pure malice twisted his aristocratic features. "Holmes!" he spat, always the interfering schoolboy. Without another word, he violently shoved his burly accomplice backward into the nearest advancing constable to create a sudden, chaotic diversion, then made a desperate scrambling dash for a waiting horse tied to a nearby fence post. "After him, Watson! Do not let him mount!" Holmes shouted. Blackwood scrambled onto the horse, but before he could dig his heels in and spur the beast into a gallop, Holmes launched himself forward with the agility of a panther. He grabbed the leather bridle, his weight causing the panicked horse to rear violently into the night air. Blackwood, cursing loudly, drew a heavy lead-weighted riding crop and swung it viciously at Holmes's exposed head. Holmes ducked with practised ease, the crop whistling a hair's breadth from his ear through the hot air. Using his momentum, Holmes reached up, grabbed Blackwood by the lapels of his fine coat, and dragged him violently from the saddle. They tumbled together into the dry, chalky summer dust, rolling dangerously close to the edge of the excavation pit. With a choked gasp from the dealer and the sharp clatter of the dropped riding crop against a stone, a thick cloud of stifling dust plumed over them. Blackwood clawed desperately at Holmes's face, but Holmes's knowledge of baritsu and bare-knuckle fighting prevailed. Within seconds, Holmes had quickly pinned the antiquities dealer to the ground. His knee pressed firmly and unforgivingly into the man's chest. Nearby, Lestrade's men had successfully wrestled the brawny labourer to the dirt and secured him with heavy irons. Lestrade arrived at the edge of the pit, panting heavily in the heat, wiping grime from his face. "A clean sweep, Mr. Holmes. The scoundrel is caught red-handed with the stolen goods." Holmes hauled Silas Blackwood to his feet, ignoring the man's furious struggling. He surveyed the ruined, dusty aristocrat with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. "You may have found the gold, Blackwood, yet you have wilfully, maliciously destroyed a brilliant human mind in the process. The theft of historical artifacts is a crime against the Crown. The theft of a man's very soul and identity is a crime against nature itself. I shall make it my personal mission to see to it that you face the absolute maximum penalty the law allows for both atrocities." A week later, Baker Street was marginally cooler, a violent summer thunderstorm having finally swept through the Thames Valley, breaking the suffocating heat wave and leaving the air smelling of wet slate and ozone. Professor Ainsworth sat once more in our armchair, observing the rain lash heavily against the window pane. Silas Blackwood was securely lodged in a damp cell at Newgate, awaiting trial with no hope of bail, and the magnificent Kentish hoard was under the heavily armed protection of the British Museum's Antiquities Department. Holmes had spent the entire morning at Scotland Yard, explaining the full dark timeline of the abduction, the pharmacological subjugation, and the mesmeric torture to Lestrade and the prosecutors, ensuring the police had an ironclad case that would put Blackwood away for decades. Now our sitting room was quiet, save for the crackle of a small fire we had lit to chase away the damp. "Will he ever truly recover, Holmes?" I asked softly, watching the professor. The old man was mindlessly, rhythmically tracing the raised rim of the Athenian tetradrachm with his thumb, a hollow, distant look in his pale eyes. Holmes's sharp expression softened into something resembling genuine pity. The human mind is an infinitely delicate instrument, Watson. It is a tapestry of memories that, once violently unravelled, is exceedingly difficult to weave back together. The psychological and neurological damage inflicted by Blackwood's prolonged narcotic and hypnotic regimen was exceptionally severe. He designed the trauma to simultaneously erase the memory of the terrifying ordeal and leave the professor profoundly, permanently disoriented. The physicians in Harley Street hold out some hope for a partial recovery over the coming years, though I fear the great, towering intellect of Arthur Ainsworth may be forever fragmented, reduced to echoes and shadows. Professor Ainsworth seemed to hear his name. He looked up, turning away from the rain-streaked window, a faint, incredibly gentle smile touching his lips. He held out the silver coin toward Holmes, his hand trembling slightly less than it had a week prior. "A beautiful thing, is it not, Mr. Holmes? I feel as though I used to know its story. I feel I knew the men who minted it." "You did, Professor," Holmes replied gently, reaching out to accept the coin, his voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. "You knew it better than any man alive, and thanks to your life's work, the world will soon know its story too." As the rain washed the London streets clean, carrying away the grime of the summer heat, I could only marvel at the tragic, inescapable duality of our success. The buried history of the earth had been gloriously recovered, preserved for future generations, even as the rich, irreplaceable history of one man's beautiful mind was tragically washed away into the dark. Want to unlock the next story early? Do not forget to check out our Patreon using the link below.